the summer of 2019, a man named Dale Pruitt pulled up to a 480-acre dryland operation outside of Sublette, Kansas, in Haskell County, stepped out of a white University Extension pickup with a Kansas State emblem on the door, and walked the field rows in clean company-issued boots, while the young woman farming them stood back and let him look. Dale had a Ph.D. in crop science and 22 years with the Co-op Extension Service, and he was not a cruel man. He was a thorough one. He walked to the end of a row, crouched down, pinched a grain head between two fingers, and said, "Nora, I want to be straight with you. What Emil was keeping here is sentimental, but it isn't commercial. This is a hobby collection." He said it the way you say something plain and obvious to someone you hope will not be embarrassed for long. He drove back to Sublette and filed a site visit note that said the operation showed significant agronomic risk due to use of non-commercial, open-pollinated germplasm. 3 years and 1 summer later, Nora Vass weighed her harvest at the Haskell County grain elevator, and the ticket printed a number that made the elevator operator read it twice. That number was 4,280 pounds per acre. The county average for dryland sorghum in 2022 was 1,190 pounds per acre. The worst drought in a generation had rolled through southwest Kansas between June and August of that year and taken 47% of the county's grain sorghum yield with it. Ray Stout, Nora's neighbor to the north, lost 580 of his 640 acres outright. The Pioneer hybrid seed, planted countywide, showed 40% stand loss by the first day of August. This is the story of how a dead man's notebook full of dryland observations, kept in a limestone root cellar in Haskell County since 1946, outlasted every slide deck and yield projection that a credentialed and sincere system threw at it. If you have ever watched something old and underestimated hold when everything modern and expensive gave way, stay with this one. Emil Vass arrived in Haskell County in the spring of 1941 with a canvas sack of sorghum seed and a leather valise and a wife named Marta, and he came from a part of Moravia where the soil was either wet clay or frozen and nothing in between, and he had no prior experience with dryland plains farming and no reason in particular to think that would matter. He had a cousin in Sublette. He had $80. He leased 40 acres from a man named Frank Dwyer who wanted the ground farmed rather than left. Emil spoke almost no English for the first 2 years. He learned farming in Haskell County by watching what survived rather than by being told what should. In the summer of 1942, the county had a hard late July heat push, the kind that sends grain sorghum into early senescence before the grain is filled, and Emil lost a third of his first planting, but not all of it. The stalks on the east side of his field, the ones running along the fence row where the slope pulled a little more water and the clay content ran higher, kept their color 3 weeks past, the point when everything around them had gone ochre and started dying back. Emil did not have a word for what he was seeing. He cut seed heads from those stalks with a jackknife and put them in a cloth bag and tied the bag with baling twine and wrote on it in Czech. And what he wrote translated loosely as, "lived through the hot week." He kept doing that for the next 74 years. By 1948, he had 30 acres of his own land, bought in 2 payments from Frank Dwyer's estate. By 1955, he had 160, and the root cellar behind the farmhouse held 12 cloth bags on a cedar shelf Emil had built himself, each one labeled in his careful Czech script, each one representing a family of sorghum that had outlasted a specific kind of difficulty. He had bags for the 1947 dry spell, for the brutal heat of 1952, for a late August moisture deficit in 1955 that had taken nearly everything in the county and left Emil's East Field standing. He kept the root cellar at a steady temperature, with a small vent and a clay floor that held the cold, and he visited it each spring before planting and each fall after harvest. And over the years the visits grew longer. Marta brought him coffee down the cellar stairs on October evenings when the bags were being sorted. She outlived him by 3 years and never once suggested he stop. By the time Emil's seed families numbered 31, he had been farming Haskell County for 50 years, and he knew the ground the way you know a face you have lived alongside since youth. He knew which quarter section held its moisture longest in a dry year, and which had the tightest clay subsoil, and which ran sandy along the southwest corner, where the wind had reworked the surface in the dust years. He did not describe this knowledge in those terms. He described it in the ledger, one season at a time. His 1974 entry noted that the plants in the southwest corner of the east field had gone to senescence 4 days ahead of the rest, and that he would not pull seed from that corner again in a heat year. His 1980 entry noted that Line 18's seed heads from the low-slope portion of the north field had averaged 62 grams each, compared to 41 grams from the same line on the upland ground, and that the root pull on the low-slope plants dug out to a depth he could not reach with his arm. He wrote his last entry in August 2015, at 88 years old, sitting on an overturned bucket in the root cellar because his back would not let him stand for long. The entry was 6 lines in check. It described the stay-green performance of Line 7 in a dry stretch that July. It ended with a single line that his granddaughter would not read for 2 years. "This line will hold. Keep the seeds separate." Let me tell you what Emil was actually selecting for, because this is the part that makes everything else make sense, and it is also the part that Dale Pruitt had the education to understand, but not the patience to see. A grain sorghum plant under heat stress has one primary tool for survival. It can close the small pores in its leaves, called stomata, to conserve water, but closing the stomata also shuts down photosynthesis and triggers a process called senescence, where the plant essentially gives up on the current grain cycle, redirects resources to the seed head, and begins dying back from the bottom. Modern commercial hybrids are bred for maximum yield under optimal or near optimal conditions, which means they are bred for fast maturity and efficient grain fill in a good year. A drought year is not their year. Under severe heat and moisture stress, the hybrid shuts down early, the grain fill window closes before the head is full, and what you harvest is light, shrunk grain at a fraction of the expected weight. Emil's lines had been selected, generation after generation, for what agronomists now call stay green, which is the ability of a sorghum plant to maintain stalk photosynthesis and delay senescence, even when soil moisture is critically low and temperatures are extreme. The plants that Emil saved seed from in 1942 and in 1951 and in 1959 and in the dry years of 1966 and 1974 and 1980 were the ones that kept feeding their grain heads while everything around them quit. He did not know the term stay green. He called them the ones that lasted. The ledger he kept, a spiral notebook with a faded green cover that Nora still calls the book, described each saved seed family by the date of its last observation, the length of stay green after the surrounding crop had senesced, the estimated pounds per head, and a brief weather note. The entries ran from July 1946 through August 2015, the last one written in Emil's handwriting, which by then had gone very small and very careful, about 2 weeks before he went into the hospital for the last time. He died in January 2016 at 89 years old and left 480 acres, a root cellar full of cloth seed bags, and the book to his son, who was Nora's father, who was a high school principal in Garden City and had no interest in farming and leased the ground to a conventional neighbor, while the seed sat in the root cellar and Emil's ledger sat on a shelf in the farmhouse kitchen. Nora Voss was 26 years old and working as an agricultural systems consultant in Denver, Colorado, when her father called to say he was thinking of selling the sublet acres. She had a salary and an apartment lease and a boyfriend who was finishing a master's degree in environmental policy, and she did not hesitate. She moved back to Sublet in the spring of 2018. She was known among the farming families around Haskell County for two things: her refusal to apologize for what she was doing, and a patience with the book that bordered on the devotional. The farmhouse needed work. The south porch had lost 2 boards, and a neighbor's combine had clipped the corner post of the main field gate at some point, and no one had replaced it. The 1987 Ford 8000 that Emil had kept in the machine shed still ran, but the front axle had a shimmy in it, and the cab smelled of oil and old rubber and something like lanolin. Nora put on work gloves and started in the first week of May. She fixed the porch boards herself and rehung the gate and serviced the Ford, and then she went into the root cellar and did not come out for a long time. The cellar was cool and smelled of clay and cedar and something dry and faintly sweet, the way grain smells when it has been stored carefully in a dry space for years. Emil's bags were on the cedar shelf he had built along the north wall, arranged by family number in chalk marks he had made directly on the shelf board. Some of the chalk had faded, but the bags were tied with baling twine that was stiff with age, and they were labeled in Emil's script, the check first and an English note underneath in a different, younger hand that turned out to be Nora's grandmother, Marta, who had added English labels in the 1970s so the county extension agent could read them. The agent had apparently never been in the root cellar. Nora went through every entry in Emil's ledger that first summer, sitting at the cellar floor with a flashlight and a notebook. She cross-referenced the cloth bags by family number, opening each one and rolling a few seeds in her palm, smelling them, checking them against the weight Emil had noted in the ledger. She germination tested all 31 families on cloth trays laid on the cellar floor, keeping records of the count in each tray at 72 hours and again at 100 hours. 23 of Emil's original 31 seed families still showed viable germination rates above 85%. She chose the 12 with the most detailed stay green observations in the ledger as the candidates for the first commercial planting and spent the rest of the summer narrowing those to 4. Nora also had a red heeler named Cub, who had been Emil's dog and was now 12 years old and moved slowly and slept under the kitchen table and occasionally followed her to the root cellar when she worked late, lying at the top of the cellar stairs with his nose on his front paws and his eyes tracking her in the lamplight below. It was in the fall of that first year, the planning year, that Dale Pruitt heard through the county extension network that someone was moving open pollinated sorghum into commercial planting in Haskell County, and he arranged a meeting. Dale was not hostile. He brought printouts. His concern was genuine. Open pollinated sorghum, he explained, had been phased out of commercial farming in the Central Plains for a reason, and that reason was yield. A modern commercial hybrid sorghum in a normal year in southwest Kansas would produce between 4,000 and 5,500 pounds per acre under good management. Open pollinated lines typically ran 2,500 to 3,500 pounds in the same conditions, sometimes less. The yield gap was real and quantified, and in a thin-margin dryland operation, a 25% yield penalty would put her underwater inside of 3 years. "I am not dismissing what Emil did," Dale said. He held his printouts very flat on the table. Emil was a meticulous observer. But observation is not the same as agronomy. Nora said she understood the yield gap, and she had questions about stay green under stress conditions and what the hybrid trials showed under deficit moisture at the critical grain fill stage. Dale said that the hybrid trials under deficit conditions showed reduced yield, as expected, but that modern hybrids had improved drought tolerance substantially. He named 3. He said that seed science had come a very long way since Emil's time. Nora did not argue. She thanked him for coming out. He drove away, and she went back to the root cellar. She planted 480 acres of Emil's lines in the spring of 2020. She had selected 4 family lines to run. Line 7, which Emil had flagged consistently since 1959, for late-season stay green in dry years. Line 12, which showed the thickest wax bloom on the leaf surface, a trait that reduces transpiration by reducing water loss through the cuticle. Line 18, which had the deepest root pull of any line Emil had measured by hand, and line 23, which combined moderate stay green with the highest grain fill density Emil's records showed. She drilled them in alternating strips, 120 acres each, so she could watch them behave differently in the field. Her neighbor to the north, Ray Stout, was planting 640 acres in a pioneer hybrid program that year, and he had also financed a new cab-forward John Deere 9R to pull his planter. Ray was 49 years old and had been farming that ground for 20 years and had a banker who liked him and a precision ag service that wrote variable rate seeding prescriptions for each field. Ray was genuinely kind to Nora and had been a friend to Emil, and he did not think she would last 3 years. He thought it quietly and said nothing close to it aloud. The 2020 season was respectable. Nora walked her strips every week from emergence through heading, noting the tillering count on line 18 and the leaf color on line 12, and the rate at which line 7 was reaching physiological maturity versus the county composite her county agent had posted. She kept a field notebook of her own, slim and spiral-bound like Emil's, though she wrote in English and added a column Emil had not used for daily high temperature. Cub walked with her to the first flag when she went out in the morning, then turned back for the porch where the sun was. She pulled 3,100 pounds per acre across her 480 acres. Ray Stout pulled 4,400 on his best ground and 3,900 countywide across his 640, under a precision ag prescription that had cost him $34 per acre in variable rate inputs above the seed and fuel. The yield gap was real, and it was exactly what Dale Pruitt's printout had predicted. The elevator paid Nora the standard commodity rate, which in 2020 averaged $4.10 per hundredweight for grain sorghum at the sublet co-op. She did not lose money. She did not gain much either, and Cub was 13 now and spent most of his time on the porch in the sun, and the root cellar needed a new door, and the Ford still had the shimmy in its front axle. In the spring of 2021, Dale Pruitt gave a presentation at the Haskell County Ag Summit in Sublette, attended by about 60 farmers and 4 lenders. He showed yield data for the county's dryland sorghum operations across the 2020 season. Nora's numbers were in there, though she was not named. They showed as the lowest yield band on the bar graph. Dale said the data illustrated a persistent challenge in the region, namely the tendency of operators using, as he put it, relic genetics from the pre-hybrid era to accept below-market yield as a trade for a method that offered no quantifiable advantage under current conditions. What this kind of operation is doing, he said, is running a museum, not a farming program. He was not sneering. He was reading from a slide. He believed every word of it. Nora was in the back of the room. She did not say anything. She drove home and went to the root cellar and sat with the book for an hour and then went to bed. She had not expected it to sting the way it did. She had made her choice with clear eyes, and she believed in what the book told her the lines could do, and she had the first full season's data, supporting that the stay green response was real and measurable. She had seen line 18 hold its color 11 days past the point when the county composite had gone fully ochre in a brief dry stretch in late July of 2020. She had written it in her field notebook in ink. But there is a specific kind of difficulty that comes with doing a thing publicly that the room has decided is not worth doing, and it does not diminish simply because you are correct. Emil had understood this. There was a 1963 entry in the book, the year after a county extension meeting had recommended against open-pollinated sorghum for any commercial operation, that read only, "Meeting at the church hall. Stayed home. Line 7 at Flagleaf on time." The 2021 season ran decent, not a drought year and not a banner year, the kind of season that reveals nothing useful about stress tolerance and everything about yield potential under comfortable moisture. Nora averaged 3,300 pounds per acre, which was a small improvement over 2020, but still comfortably below Ray's 4,600. Ray bought a new variable rate fertilizer tender that fall for $47,000. He was positioned, his agronomist told him, to capitalize on the following season. If you have ever stood by a thing that looked foolish to every honest person around you because you could read something in it they had no way to see, you know something about what Nora Vass's 2021 felt like. The method was not failing. It was just not being tested yet. Those are two different situations, and from the outside they look the same. If you have seen something like that on your own place or in your own work, the comment section is open. I am curious what the gap between ordinary years and the one that proved it looked like from where you were standing. Then back to Haskell County, and the season that finally ran the test. He was not wrong that a good season was coming. He was wrong about which kind of season. If you have ever seen southwest Kansas in a drought year, you know what the land says before the grain does. It says it first in the soil, in the way a handful of topsoil 30 feet from the furrow goes to fine, pale dust in late May when it should still have some give in it. Then it says it in the sky, in the way the afternoon thunderheads build to the north and the west and slide around the county without dropping. By the second week of June 2022, Nora had recorded 11 days without measurable precipitation and daily high temperatures between 102 and 107 degrees Fahrenheit. And the subsoil moisture reading she pulled by hand from each of her 4 strips showed an average soil water deficit of 4.2 inches for the top 3 feet. That is the threshold at which commercial hybrid sorghum in southwest Kansas begins triggering early senescence signals. She walked the strips twice a week. The heat was a physical presence in those weeks, not just warmth, but a pressure. The way the air sits on you at 105 degrees in a field with no shade, and a south wind steady at 15 miles per hour. She wore a canvas hat Emil had left on the back porch hook, and she took her field notebook, and she wrote down the leaf angle of each line at noon, because a sorghum plant under moisture stress will roll its leaves into a cylinder, to reduce its exposed surface area and slow transpiration, and the angle at which the leaves roll tells you something precise about how the plant is coping. A line that stayed flatter at 105 degrees was spending more water than one that had curled tight, but it was also photosynthesizing better. The trade-off was the whole question. She took notes on the wax bloom on line 12's cuticle, which was visibly thicker that July than in either of the two previous seasons, the plant responding to the heat by producing more of the white waxy coating that slows water loss through the leaf surface. She ran her fingernail across a leaf, and it left a clean track in the wax the way it does in the old candle stubs in the root cellar. She noted the stalk stiffness on line 18, and she dug one plant from line 18 on July 7th, carefully, with a narrow spade, going slowly into the dry ground. And she found the root tip at 51 inches, white and alive and slightly moist in the hard clay, still pulling. Emil's 1980 drought note on line 18 read, "Dug to 54 inches, root tip still white and live, pulled moisture to the head when the west field quit." She was 3 inches short of Emil's depth. She thought that might be because 2022 had come on earlier and harder, and the roots were still working down. She replanted the dug plant carefully, tamped the soil around it, and walked back to the strip edge. The county extension office sent out a drought advisory on June 28th. It recommended that operators with significant dryland sorghum acreage contact their crop insurance agent. Nora filed the required paperwork and did not change anything she was doing. It was at the end of July that Marcus Vass arrived. Nora's younger brother was 28 years old, just finished with an agribusiness degree from Kansas State University, and he drove down from Manhattan, Kansas, in a clean sedan with a laptop bag and an air of someone doing a favor. He had run some numbers, he said, sitting at the kitchen table the first evening while Cub watched him from under it. He had compared Emil's average historical yield to the county hybrid average and projected forward under current input costs. He was not trying to be unkind. He thought she should hear the analysis. He said the operation was positioned to take a serious loss in the current season, and that she might want to consider switching to a hybrid program for the following year, and that there were also some parties who had expressed interest in the land at around $3,200 an acre, and she should know that option existed. Nora said she had walked line 18 that morning. She said Emil's note on line 18 from 1980 said it rooted to 54 inches and pulled moisture to the head when the west field quit. She said the west field around line 18 was quitting right now. She poured him a cup of coffee and went to bed. Marcus walked the strips the next morning on his own. He walked them again the following morning. He did not talk about the land sale inquiry again. On July 14th, Nora got a call from Dale Pruitt. He was calling, he said, because he wanted her to be realistic about the season. The county was going to see major losses. The hybrid programs were not performing well under the current moisture deficit. He wanted her to know that the crop insurance adjusters would be out, and she should document everything. He said if her open pollinated lines happened to perform better than the hybrids this season, she should understand that a one-year anomaly was not a proof of concept. Relic genetics sometimes catch a fluke, he said. That doesn't change the long-run arithmetic. He said it with genuine care. He believed it when he said it. By August 1st, Ray Stout had lost 580 of his 640 acres to combined heat and drought stress. The Pioneer hybrid had shown 40% stand loss countywide by that date. Ray's remaining 60 acres on his best-watered low ground had struggling plants with early senescence already advanced past the grain-fill stage, His agronomist drove out, looked at the field, and told him to file for total loss insurance on the 580 acres. Ray nodded and called his banker that afternoon. He told Nora about it on the road, standing between their fence lines, and there was nothing to say that was not cruel or useless, and Nora did not say anything. She just stood with him for a while. Let me tell you what was happening in Nora's fields during the same weeks. Line 18 had roots at 54 inches, just as Emile had written in 1980 under similar conditions. At the 54-inch depth in Haskell County that summer, there was still subsoil moisture. Not much, maybe 1.1 inches of plant-available water, but it was enough. The roots were pulling it slowly and steadily, at a rate of transpiration reduced by roughly 18%, because Line 12's waxy cuticle character had crossed into the Line 18 plants after a decade of natural cross-pollination within Emile's seed families. A thing Emile had tracked in the book and deliberately allowed because he noticed the combined plants came through dry weeks better than either parent line alone. The stay-green character of Line 7 was delaying senescence across all 4 strips. The stalks had gone from deep green to a blue-gray in the heat, which is not dying, only the wax thickening on the leaf surface as the plant reduces its water vapor loss. The grain heads were filling slowly. They would fill to completion. Marcus had stopped looking at his laptop. He started going to the root cellar in the evenings. Nora found him one night sitting at the cellar floor with the book open on his knee, reading Emile's check entries and typing them into a translation app. He looked up and said he thought Line 23 might be combining 3 characters at once, and asked whether Emile had ever noted whether the line crossed naturally with Line 12 or whether it was self-pollinated. Nora said Emile's 1997 entry suggested it was a natural cross, and she showed him where it was in the book. They sat in the root cellar for 2 hours. Marcus did not go back to Manhattan that week. The county crop insurance adjusters began their rounds in the 3rd week of August. The county average yield estimate came back at 1,190 pounds per acre for dryland sorghum, against a 5-year average of 3,600. The losses were not theoretical. They were measured in empty elevator tickets and bank calls made in quiet offices on quiet afternoons, and they touched 41 farms in Haskell County. Sandra Ochoa came to Haskell County in September, before the final harvest was in, because someone at the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Specialty Crops Office had called her about an open-pollinated sorghum operation that appeared to be standing well in a county-wide failure year. Sandra was 58 years old and the senior grain buyer for Kansas Heritage Foods in Wichita, a specialty food company that processed gluten-free sorghum flour and waxy sorghum products for bakery accounts. She had been looking for a stable supply of waxy, open-pollinated sorghum grain for 3 years and had not found a commercial source. She drove to Sublette in a silver SUV, and Nora met her at the field gate. Sandra walked Line 12 first because the wax bloom was visible from the road. She picked a grain head, shelled a handful of kernels into her palm, held them up in the afternoon light, then put one between her molars. She was quiet for a long time. She said, "What is the variety designation on this line?" Nora said there was no commercial designation. It was her grandfather's selection. Line 12, a family he had kept since 1955. Sandra said, "Does he have documentation on the selection history?" Nora said he had a notebook going back to 1946. Sandra was quiet again. She said, "I am not going to negotiate a price with you today. I need to see your yield ticket from the elevator first. But I want you to know that if this grain is what it looks like under the Pearl test, I'm going to offer you a contract, and the number is going to surprise you." Nora said she understood. Sandra said, "The pearl test is a simple thing. A waxy sorghum grain held to the light shows a specific translucency, almost a glow in the center. That is the waxy endosperm, which is a starch profile highly sought for gluten-free milling. Your line 12 shows it. So does your line 23, from what I can see from here." The elevator tickets came in the second week of October. Nora had asked Marcus to come with her. He was the one who took the ticket from the operator. He looked at it and went very still. And then he handed it to Nora without saying anything, and Nora read it. And she stood in the elevator office for a long moment without speaking. 4,280 pounds per acre. Across 480 acres of open, pollinated, 80-year selected dryland sorghum in Haskell County, Kansas, in the worst drought year in a generation, Nora Vass had harvested 4,280 pounds per acre. The elevator operator said, "Ma'am, I checked that twice." The county average was 1,190. Ray Stout's surviving 60 acres had come in at 310 pounds per acre. The 580 acres he lost were not in that average at all. The number did not land like a vindication. It landed like a fact that had been waiting a long time to be stated, quietly, to whoever happened to be in the room. Sandra Ochoa drove back from Wichita the following week. She brought a contract for 2,054,400 pounds of grain at 31 cents per pound, specialty food grade, waxy sorghum for gluten-free flour processing. She set the contract on the kitchen table and said she was not willing to negotiate the price downward. She said the waxy endosperm profile in Emil's line 12 and line 23 was not something she could source elsewhere at volume. She said she had looked at the ledger documentation, and she would like to talk about a long-term supply agreement. The gross on that single harvest was $636,864. Dale Pruitt called 3 days after the elevator tickets were filed countywide, when the numbers were part of the formal Extension Service crop report. He did not pretend the call was about something else. He said he had seen Nora's yield, and he owed her a conversation. He said he had been wrong in his assessment, and he was not careful or defensive about saying it. He said he had been looking at the data from the 5 dryland operations in Haskell County that had run open-pollinated sorghum in 2022, and he said that Nora's result was not the only one that had outperformed the county average, though hers was the largest and the most complete, and that what he was seeing suggested that the stress tolerance characters Emil had selected for over a long span of dry years had produced something the hybrid breeding programs had simply not been selecting for. Because the programs were selecting across a range of environments and years, rather than in one place across one specific pattern of stress. He said that was not how the programs were designed to work, and he was not blaming the programs. He said that Emil had been doing something different, and he had not understood what it was. He said he had been thinking about what it meant that 80 years of observation in one county had produced a stress tolerance profile that he, with a PhD and 22 years of extension work, had dismissed as a hobby collection. He said he thought it would be worth writing up properly. He said that quietly, in the voice of a person who has updated a view he held sincerely, and is not performing the update. Nora told him she would show him the book. She said Marcus was working on a full transcription of Emil's check entries, and she thought it would take another 6 months. She said when it was done, she would have Dale out to the cellar. Dale said he would like that. He asked whether Emil had published anything or corresponded with the Extension Service at any point over the decades. Nora said no. Dale said nothing for a moment. Then he said he supposed that was part of it, and thanked her and got off the phone. That winter, 7 farming families in Haskell County came to the vast operation and asked to be taught the system. They called or stopped by the road in November and December, and Nora told each of them to come in January, and she would make time. She did not charge for the instruction. Nora and Marcus ran a 2-day seed selection workshop in January in the root cellar and the barn, going through Emil's selection protocol line by line, explaining stay green and the wax bloom and how to test germination on cloth trays, explaining how to keep an observation ledger and what to note and when and why the date and the weather condition mattered as much as the plant measurement. They explained what subsoil moisture sampling told you and what it did not. Marcus had put together a 1-page summary of Emil's 10 key selection criteria from the transcribed check entries, written out plainly, and he printed 15 copies on the farmhouse printer and handed them out the first morning. Ray Stout was the 8th family. He came alone and sat in the back row and listened the whole first day without asking a question. And on the second day he asked whether line 18's deep-root character was heritable enough to select for in a single generation. And Nora said yes, if you chose your seed heads from the driest end of the strip, and Ray wrote that down in his own notebook. Nora sold certified seed stock to 4 of the 7 operations, at cost plus handling. She paid the root cellar a new door and the 1987 Ford a rebuilt front axle, and kept the rest of the money in an operating account. She did not scale. The 480 acres were what they were, and they were enough. Marcus stayed. He took over the observation ledger at the start of the 2023 season, writing in English and adding a new column Emil had not used, soil temperature at 6 inches, which the County Extension Service had started tracking in 2018. He wrote the date in Emil's style, the season and the moisture conditions and the line number and what he observed. The first entry in Marcus's handwriting in the book was dated April 19th, 2023. The last entry in Emil's handwriting, 8 years before, was dated August 3rd, 2015. The book did not know about the gap. Cub died in February of that year at 15, on the kitchen floor in the morning light, and Nora buried him in the corner of line 18 where the roots went deepest. She said nothing about it to anyone for a long time, and the ledger recorded the spring planting as though the season did not know it had lost anything. What Dale Pruitt knew, with all of his credentials and his good faith and his slide decks, was a kind of knowledge built to travel. It moved through journals and extension reports and county-wide averages, and it measured what an average acre, under average conditions, in an average year, could be expected to produce. That is useful knowledge. It is not wrong. It simply cannot see what it has no category for. What Emil Vass knew was built to stay. It had no credential behind it, no university affiliation, no published protocol. It was 74 years of watching one patch of southwest Kansas ground behave under stress, and writing down what lived and saving seed from those plants, and doing it again the following year. It was the kind of knowing that is not transferable as data, only as attention and time, and only in the place where the attention was paid. These two kinds of knowing collide in every generation, and in most years the credentialed kind wins because most years are close enough to average. The structural antagonist is not the sincerely wrong expert. The structural antagonist is an extreme year, a drought year, a blight year, a year that goes well outside the range of the average case, is the only trial that can settle the question the spreadsheet cannot answer. which is not what performs best, but what endures. What is rigid holds until the extreme year, and then it does not hold at all. What is adapted to one specific piece of ground, selected across seasons rather than bred for the average of all regions, may look indistinguishable from stubbornness right up until the moment it does not look like anything except the truth. The book is still in the root cellar. Marcus transcribed all of Emil's check entries by the following October, and the full ledger is now typed and archived, and there are digital copies in 3 places, but the original notebook sits on the same shelf where Nora first found it, under a lamp she leaves on. The seed bags are still in cloth, still tied with baling twine, still written on in 2 generations of handwriting. And this spring, a 3rd handwriting appeared on a new bag, Marcus's, small and careful in the corner, the way you write something when you know it is meant to last. What survives is what belongs to the ground it grew from.